The sound of shattering glass jerked me out of my trance. I looked down and realized the coffee mug had slipped from my hand, its remnants scattering across the kitchen tiles. My pulse raced, but it wasn't the mug that shook me. It was the thought I'd had just moments before. What if I'd just left? The idea had slithered into my mind uninvited, bold and sharp. Leave the house. Leave David. Leave this hollow life I'd been pretending was enough. I crouched down to pick up the pieces, hands trembling as the sharp edges bit into my fingers. Damn it, I hissed, but the pain barely registered. The front door slammed, and for a moment, my heart lifted. Maybe David had come home early, a rare gesture that might mean something was about to change. But then I heard the familiar voice of our neighbor, Susan. "Knew I'd find you cleaning up something," she said, stepping into the kitchen like she owned the place. She glanced at the shattered mug. "Rough morning." I forced a smile, the kind I'd perfected over years of pretending I was fine. "Just clumsy, I guess." Susan launched into her usual chatter about neighborhood drama, the new family moving into the McAllister house, her dog's latest vet visit, her husband's golf addiction. I nodded in all the right places, but my mind kept drifting to the idea that had shaken me so completely. Could I really leave? Before I could even fully process the thought, Susan gasped. "Oh my God, is that him?" I followed her gaze out the window and froze. A moving van was parked across the street, and in front of it stood a man unloading boxes. Not just any man, a tall, broad-shouldered figure in a white t-shirt and jeans, his dark hair tousled by the breeze. His movements were fluid, efficient, and there was something magnetic about the way he commanded the space around him, like he was meant to be noticed. "Hello, new neighbor," Susan whispered conspiratorially, nudging me with her elbow. "That's not the kind of sight we usually get around here." I rolled my eyes, trying to play it cool. But when his eyes flicked up and met mine through the window, my breath caught. He smiled, just a small, polite curve of his lips, but it was enough to send a jolt through me. I ducked behind the curtain, feeling ridiculous and oddly exhilarated. "What's wrong with you?" Susan asked, laughing. "Nothing," I lied, my cheeks burning. The day passed in a blur of uneventful chores, but my mind was anything but quiet. I kept replaying that moment at the window, the fleeting connection that felt like a spark in an otherwise lifeless existence. Later that afternoon, I found myself standing at the edge of my driveway, pretending to admire the hydrangeas. In reality, I was watching the moving truck. He was still there, carrying what looked like a heavy bookshelf with ease. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice deep but warm. "Do you know where the nearest hardware store is?" I froze, my heart pounding as if he'd just asked me to solve a riddle. Yeah," I stammered, pointing vaguely toward the main road. "About 10 minutes that way. Can't miss it." He smiled again, this time a little wider. "Thanks. I'm Jake, by the way. Just moved in." "Carol," I said, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "Well, thanks, Carol. If I get lost, I'll blame you." He winked and climbed into his truck, leaving me standing there like a fool. That evening, as I sat alone at the dinner table, David's absence felt heavier than ever. He'd called earlier to say he'd be working late again, and I'd hung up before he could hear the crack in my voice. My mind kept circling back to Jake, the ease in his smile, the way he carried himself like he had nothing to hide. It wasn't attraction, not exactly. It was curiosity. Who was he? Why did a stranger feel like the most alive thing I'd encountered in years? When David finally came home, his greeting was as perfunctory as always, a kiss on the cheek, a muttered apology about work, and then silence. I watched him settle into his usual spot on the couch, his eyes glued to his laptop. I opened my mouth to speak, to say something, anything, but the words felt useless. Instead, I went upstairs, crawled into bed, and stared at the ceiling. The restlessness I'd felt earlier didn't fade. It grew, twisting into something sharper, something that felt suspiciously like hope. The slam of the front door echoed through the house, followed by the clatter of a suitcase being dropped in the hallway. I was in the kitchen, elbow deep in soapy water, scrubbing dishes from the night before. "Carol?" David's voice carried through, a rare note of energy cutting through his usual monotone. I turned, dishcloth in hand, just as David strode into the room. Behind him trailed a young man with messy, sun-kissed hair, wearing a faded hoodie and carrying a backpack slung lazily over one shoulder. "This is Justin," David said, gesturing behind him. "My nephew. He'll be staying with us for a bit while he's on summer break." Justin stepped forward, offering an easy smile and a handshake. "Hey, Aunt Carol. Thanks for having me." His voice was warm, casual, and completely at odds with the awkwardness I felt. I took his hand briefly, startled by the confidence in his grip. "Of course," I said, managing a smile. "Welcome." The next few minutes were a blur of introductions and logistical chatter about where he'd stay and what he'd need. Before I knew it, David had disappeared back to his office, leaving me alone with Justin, who was rummaging through the fridge like he'd lived here forever. "Hungry?" I asked, trying to break the silence. He glanced over his shoulder, grinning. "Starving." "Got anything good?" I laughed despite myself, pulling out some leftovers. He plopped onto one of the bar stools, his presence filling the space in a way I hadn't anticipated. Over lunch, we talked about everything and nothing: his college classes, his favorite bands, the long drive down from Seattle. There was an ease to him, a charm that made conversation flow effortlessly. But every now and then, I'd catch him looking at me, longer than necessary, his eyes studying me like I was more than just his uncle's wife. At first, I brushed it off as my imagination. But as the days passed, it became harder to ignore. It was the third day when things took a turn. I'd just stepped out of the shower, a towel wrapped around me, when I heard a knock at the door. "Aunt Carol?" Justin's voice called through. "Sorry, but the Wi-Fi password isn't working." I froze, clutching the towel tighter. "I'll be right out." By the time I emerged, dressed and composed, he was waiting in the hallway, leaning casually against the wall. His eyes flicked over me, just for a second, but long enough to leave a mark. "It's written on the router," I said, pointing toward the living room. "Oh, right," he said, flashing that boyish grin again. "Sorry to bother you." He wasn't bothering me. That was the problem. The next morning, I found Justin in the kitchen, shirtless, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone. The sight stopped me in my tracks. "Morning," he said, glancing up. "Morning," I managed, averting my eyes as I busied myself with the coffee maker. Uncle David already left. "Early meeting," I said, my voice too bright, too sharp. Justin leaned against the counter, his presence unnervingly calm. "You've been really kind to let me stay here," he said. "I know it's probably a hassle." "It's not," I said quickly. "We're happy to have you." "Yeah," he said, his tone dipping into something softer, more serious. "You've been amazing, you know. I mean it." I glanced at him, caught off guard by the sincerity in his expression. For a moment, the air between us felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. I broke the moment, turning back to the coffee maker. "Well, someone has to keep this house running," I joked, trying to keep my voice light. Justin chuckled, but when I glanced at him again, his gaze hadn't wavered. That evening, David announced he'd be traveling for work the next week. The words barely registered. My thoughts were a tangle of confusion and unease. Justin's presence was beginning to feel too familiar, too comfortable. And the way he looked at me. Later, as I folded laundry in the living room, Justin came in, carrying a glass of water. He hesitated in the doorway, as if deciding whether to say something. "Do you ever get tired of all this?" he asked suddenly, gesturing vaguely at the house around us. "What do you mean?" "This," he said, sitting on the arm of the couch. The routines. The quiet. Doesn't it get lonely? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. Everyone feels lonely sometimes, I said carefully. Justin's gaze didn't leave mine. I guess. But you deserve more than that. For a moment, the room seemed to shrink, the air growing impossibly dense. I forced myself to look away, my heart pounding in my chest. I should check on dinner, I said, standing abruptly. But as I walked away, I felt his eyes on me, heavy and unrelenting. The tension had taken root, and I didn't know how to stop it. You don't look old enough to have a kid in college, Justin said, his tone teasing, but there was something behind his words that made my chest tighten. We were sitting on the porch, the twilight casting everything in soft hues of orange and purple. I'd poured us both glasses of lemonade, and the summer air hung heavy with the scent of freshly cut grass. Flattery will get you nowhere, I replied, trying to keep my voice light. Justin leaned back in his chair, a crooked grin tugging at the corner of his lips. I'm serious. You've got this energy about you. You don't seem like someone who's just settled. His words hung between us, weighted and unspoken. I looked away, focusing on the condensation dripping down my glass. Settled isn't always bad, I said finally. Sometimes it just means you've found stability. Justin shrugged, his gaze fixed on me. Or it means you've stopped fighting for what you want. My breath hitched, and I had to force myself to meet his eyes. They were steady, unflinching, and it felt like he could see straight through me. It had started innocently enough. Over the past few days, Justin and I had fallen into a rhythm. Breakfasts on the porch, quick conversations in the kitchen. But somehow, without either of us noticing, those moments stretched longer and became deeper. He asked questions no one else ever bothered to ask. What do you miss most about when you were younger? If you could live anywhere, where would it be? Are you happy? The last question caught me off guard. I'd been tidying up the living room, and he'd asked it so casually, like he already knew the answer. I'm content, I said, avoiding his gaze. That's not the same thing, he replied softly. One afternoon, we sat by the backyard pool, our feet dangling in the cool water. David was out of town, and the silence of the house felt less oppressive with Justin's company. You know, he said, swirling his foot in the water, I always thought adults had it all figured out. But now that I'm older, I realize no one really knows what they're doing. I laughed, the sound surprising even me. We just get better at pretending. Justin tilted his head, studying me. You don't pretend very well. The statement was so blunt, so unexpected, that I didn't know how to respond. He smiled, sensing my discomfort. That's not a bad thing, he added. It's nice, seeing someone real for a change. It was that evening when things shifted again. We were in the kitchen, and I was slicing strawberries for a dessert I didn't even feel like eating. Justin leaned against the counter, watching me, his presence steady and familiar. Why do you stay? He asked suddenly. The knife paused mid-slice. What do you mean? With him, Justin said, his voice quiet. Why do you stay if it doesn't make you happy? I gripped the counter, my knuckles whitening. That's not something I should talk about with you. Why not? He pressed, stepping closer. Because, I said, my voice trembling. You're my husband's nephew, and this is what? He asked, his voice low and steady. Complicated, I whispered, refusing to meet his gaze. Justin exhaled, his frustration palpable. Maybe complicated is just another word for scared. The words cut deep, sharper than the knife in my hand. I turned to face him, my chest tightening. You don't know what you're talking about, I said, more harshly than I intended. Don't I? He asked, his eyes searching mine. For a moment, the air between us felt too thick to breathe. And then, as if realizing the weight of what he'd just said, Justin stepped back, running a hand through his hair. I'm sorry, he muttered, his voice softer now. I didn't mean to push. I nodded, unable to speak. My pulse was racing, my thoughts tangled in a web of guilt, fear, and something else I couldn't name. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying our conversation over and over. His words had struck a nerve I hadn't even known was raw. Why did I stay? Was it for stability? Comfort? Or was it because I was too afraid to face the unknown? When I finally drifted off, my dreams were restless, filled with images of Justin's piercing gaze and the questions I couldn't answer. The next morning, I found Justin in the garden, pulling weeds with a focus that seemed almost meditative. "I thought you said this wasn't your thing," I teased, hoping to break the tension from the night before. He glanced up, the corners of his mouth twitching into a faint smile. "Figured I'd give it a shot. Never too late to try something new, right?" His words felt loaded, but I didn't press. Instead, I sat on the porch, watching him work, my heart heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. I knew we were walking a fine line, and I wasn't sure how much longer we could keep pretending it didn't exist. The fork slipped from my hand, clattering against the plate and breaking the fragile silence at the dinner table. "Sorry," I murmured, fumbling to pick it up. My cheeks burned as I avoided Justin's eyes, but I could feel them on me, steady and unrelenting. David was still on his phone, scrolling through emails while absently chewing his steak. It was as if Justin and I were the only ones in the room. "You okay?" Justin asked, his voice low enough that only I could hear. I nodded quickly, the heat in my face spreading down my neck. "Just clumsy tonight." But it wasn't just tonight. Ever since Justin had arrived, I felt like my world had shifted slightly off its axis. Earlier that day, I'd told myself I needed space, a break from the quiet tension that seemed to follow Justin and me like a shadow. I'd gone for a long drive, windows down, music loud, hoping the open road would clear my head. It didn't. By the time I got back, I found Justin in the living room, flipping through channels with a bored expression. When he saw me, his face lit up in a way that made my pulse quicken. "Thought you'd run away," he teased. "Not quite," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. But the truth was I had considered it. Now, sitting across from him at the dinner table, I felt trapped between guilt and something far more dangerous. David was oblivious as always, his attention glued to his screen. Justin, however, was fully present, his gaze flicking to me every time I moved. "Pass the salt," Justin asked, his hand reaching across the table. Our fingers brushed as I handed him the shaker, and the contact sent a jolt up my arm. It was such a small thing, barely a second, but the heat lingered long after our hands separated. I glanced at him, and for a moment, our eyes locked. The air felt thick, and I couldn't breathe. "Thanks," he said, his voice softer now. I nodded, quickly looking away. My heart was pounding so loudly, I was sure he could hear it. After dinner, David retreated to his office, mumbling something about a report that couldn't wait. I busied myself with the dishes, hoping the mindless task would calm the storm inside me. "Need help?" Justin's voice came from behind me, startling me enough that I dropped the dish sponge into the sink. I turned, shaking my head. "No, I've got it." He didn't move. Instead, he leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching me with a quiet intensity that made it impossible to focus. "You've been quiet tonight," he said, his tone careful. "I'm fine," I replied, my voice tighter than I intended. "Are you?" he pressed, stepping closer. I froze, gripping the edge of the sink as his proximity sent my thoughts spiraling. "Justin, this isn't." "Isn't what?" he interrupted, his voice low but firm. I turned to face him, and the look in his eyes made my breath catch. It wasn't just curiosity or teasing. It was something deeper, something that mirrored the conflict raging inside me. "This isn't right," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he took a step back, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You're right," he said finally. "It's not." And just like that, he walked away, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the sound of my own ragged breathing. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as my thoughts raced. I tried to tell myself that it was nothing, that I was reading too much into his words, his actions. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wanted him. The realization hit me like a wave, crashing over everything I thought I knew about myself. I was a wife, a mother, a woman who had built her entire life on the foundation of stability and morality. And yet, here I was, teetering on the edge of something I couldn't even name. The worst part was I didn't want to stop. The next morning, I avoided Justin as much as I could. I left early for the grocery store, taking my time wandering the aisles even though we didn't need much. When I returned, I busied myself with laundry, cleaning, anything to keep my mind and hands occupied. But avoidance only made the tension grow. That evening, as I sat on the couch with a book I wasn't actually reading, Justin walked in. He hesitated in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, before finally sitting down on the other end of the couch. "You've been avoiding me," he said, cutting straight to the point. "I've been busy," I replied, not looking up from the page. "Carol," he said, his voice soft but insistent. I glanced at him, my heart racing. His expression was serious, his eyes filled with a mix of frustration and something that looked like longing. "We can't keep pretending this isn't happening," he said quietly. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong. But I couldn't, because he wasn't. A knock at my bedroom door sent a jolt through me. I glanced at the clock. 11:47 p.m. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioner. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice shaky as I tightened my robe around me. "It's me," Justin's voice came, quiet but steady. "Can I talk to you for a second?" I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to tell him to go back to bed, to pretend I hadn't heard him. But my feet moved before my brain could catch up, and I opened the door. He stood there in a plain t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair tousled like he'd been lying awake, wrestling with his thoughts. "What's wrong?" I asked, keeping my tone even. I couldn't sleep," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Can I come in?" I hesitated, glancing down the hallway to make sure David's door was still closed. Then, against every ounce of better judgment I had, I stepped aside. He sat on the edge of the armchair near the window, while I perched on the foot of my bed, my arms crossed tightly over my chest. "I've been thinking," Justin began, his voice low. "That's dangerous," I said, attempting a weak joke to break the tension. He didn't laugh. "About what I said earlier. About us." I stiffened, my stomach twisting into knots. "Justin, there is no us." His eyes met mine, piercing and unrelenting. "You don't believe that any more than I do." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, the silence stretched, filled only by the faint sound of crickets outside the window. "It's not just me, is it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You feel it too." My throat tightened, and I looked away, focusing on the pattern of the rug beneath my feet. "Justin, you're my husband's nephew. This can't happen." "But it already is," he said, leaning forward. "You know it is." The tension in the room was suffocating, and I could feel my resolve crumbling under the weight of his words. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Because I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his words tumbling out in a rush. "The way you smile when you don't think anyone's watching. The way you try so hard to keep everything together, even when you're falling apart inside." I stood abruptly, the flood of emotions too overwhelming to contain. "You need to leave, Justin. This isn't right. It's not fair to you, to me, to anyone." But he didn't move. Instead, he stood too, closing the space between us in 2 quick steps. You deserve to be seen, Carol, he said, his voice raw and earnest. To be heard. When was the last time anyone looked at you the way you deserve? Tears welled in my eyes, blurring my vision. You don't know what you're talking about. I do, he insisted. And so do you. Before I could stop him, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The contact sent a shockwave through me, and I stepped back instinctively, my breath hitching. Justin, I began, but the words died in my throat as he took another step closer. I know this is wrong, he said softly, but it doesn't feel that way when I'm with you. His hand hovered near mine, waiting, as if giving me the choice to pull away. Every rational thought screamed at me to stop this now, to put an end to whatever was happening between us. But my body betrayed me, frozen in place as the space between us seemed to shrink to nothing. His fingers brushed my cheek, so gently it almost wasn't real. I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the warmth of his touch, the intensity of the moment. I can't, I whispered, my voice trembling. You don't have to, he replied, his voice steady. When I opened my eyes, his gaze was locked on mine, searching, pleading. And then it happened. He leaned in, his lips brushing mine in the softest, most fleeting of kisses. For a moment, the world seemed to stop, the weight of everything else disappearing as I let myself feel, really feel, for the first time in years. But as quickly as it began, reality came crashing back. I pulled away, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. This can't happen, I said, my voice breaking. You need to go. Now. Justin's expression fell, but he nodded, stepping back. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I shouldn't have. He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with my guilt and the echo of something I couldn't name. I collapsed onto the bed, my chest heaving as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. And the worst part? A part of me didn't regret it. Are you avoiding me? Justin's voice cut through the stillness of the living room like a blade. I froze mid-step, caught between the kitchen and the hallway, clutching a mug of tea I'd made solely to keep my hands busy. He was sitting on the couch, his posture tense, his eyes locked on me. I'm not, I said quickly, my voice faltering under his gaze. Then why can't you look at me? He asked, standing now, his words steady but laced with frustration. I opened my mouth to argue, to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. He was right. I hadn't been able to look at him since that night, hadn't been able to think about anything else, either. Justin, this isn't. Don't, he interrupted, taking a step closer. Don't tell me this isn't something. I know you feel it too. I clutched the mug tighter, the heat of the ceramic grounding me against the storm building inside. It doesn't matter what I feel, I whispered. It matters to me, he shot back, his voice softening but losing none of its intensity. I should have walked away. Should have told him to leave and never brought it up again. But instead, I stayed rooted in place, my heart pounding as he closed the space between us. Why are you doing this? I asked, my voice breaking. Because I can't stop thinking about you, he admitted, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. About the way you look when you're lost in thought. About the way you laugh when you're trying not to. About how you make me feel like I'm not invisible. His words hit me harder than I expected, peeling away layers of defenses I hadn't even realized I'd built. I'm not what you think I am, I said, shaking my head. I'm not some fantasy. I'm broken, Justin. I'm a mess. Maybe, he said, stepping closer. But so am I. His hand reached out, hesitant, brushing against mine. The contact sent a shockwave through me, but I didn't pull away. You need to stop, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Tell me you don't want this, he whispered. Look me in the eye and tell me you feel nothing, and I'll stop. I tried. I really did. But when I met his gaze, the words died on my lips. Because I couldn't lie. Not to him. Not to myself. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us. My hands trembled as I reached for him, pulling him into a kiss that was messy and desperate and everything I had been denying for far too long. For a moment, the weight of the world disappeared. There was no guilt, no fear, only the intoxicating freedom of giving in. But as quickly as the euphoria came, reality crashed down. I pulled away, my breathing ragged, my chest tight. "This is wrong," I said, my voice trembling. Justin's expression was conflicted, a mixture of longing and regret. "I know," he said softly, "but it doesn't feel wrong when I'm with you." We sat in silence, the air between us heavy with the weight of what we'd done. I wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain, but the words felt meaningless. "I don't know how to fix this," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it doesn't need fixing," he said, his gaze steady. "It does," I said firmly. "Because this, whatever this is, it's going to destroy everything." He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "Then tell me what to do, Carol. Tell me how to stop feeling this way." I didn't have an answer. I wasn't even sure I wanted one. Later that night, I sat alone in my bedroom, staring at the empty space where Justin had been. The guilt was suffocating, wrapping around me like a vice. But beneath it, there was something else, something I couldn't ignore. For the first time in years, I felt alive. And that terrified me more than anything. The moment David walked into the kitchen, I knew I'd run out of time. He set his briefcase on the counter with a thud, his sharp eyes narrowing as they settled on me. "You're distracted again," he said, his voice low but edged with suspicion. "I'm fine," I replied too quickly, focusing on the pot of coffee I didn't actually need. "Carol," he said, his tone shifting. "You haven't been fine for weeks. What's going on?" The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. I could feel the weight of his stare, the tension building like a storm about to break. Upstairs, Justin was in his room, unaware of the confrontation brewing below. Or maybe he wasn't. Maybe he knew exactly what was happening and was waiting for me to unravel. "You've been distant," David pressed, stepping closer, snapping at me, avoiding my calls. "What aren't you telling me?" My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might drown him out. My hands trembled as I gripped the edge of the counter. I wanted to tell him, to confess everything and beg for forgiveness, but the words refused to come. "I've just been tired," I said finally, my voice barely audible. He didn't buy it. "Tired? That's it? You expect me to believe?" The sound of footsteps on the stairs cut him off. Justin appeared in the doorway, his posture casual, but his expression anything but. His eyes flicked to David and then to me, and in that moment I knew. He wasn't going to stay quiet. "Justin, go back upstairs," I said quickly, my voice trembling. But he didn't move. Instead, he stepped further into the room, his gaze steady and unflinching. "David," he began, his tone calm but loaded with meaning. "There's something you should know." Panic surged through me like ice in my veins. "Justin, don't." "No," he interrupted, his voice rising. "I'm done hiding. I can't do this anymore." David turned to me, confusion and anger flickering across his face. "What the hell is going on here?" It was as if the walls were closing in, the air too thick to breathe. I couldn't look at either of them, my mind racing with all the ways this could end. "Justin, go," I pleaded, my voice breaking. He ignored me, his attention fixed on David. "She deserves better than this," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "She deserves to be seen, to be loved, and you don't even notice her." David's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you lost her a long time ago," Justin snapped. "And maybe you never even realized it." "Stop it," I shouted, the words tearing out of me. But it was too late. David turned to me, his eyes narrowing. What's he talking about, Carol? I opened my mouth to answer, but no sound came. The truth was a fire in my chest, burning me from the inside out. I love her, Justin said, his voice steady despite the chaos unraveling around him. The room fell deathly silent. David's expression hardened into something I didn't recognize, something cold and dangerous. You're kidding me, he said, his voice low. Tell me this isn't true. I couldn't. In that moment, the weight of every choice I'd made came crashing down. I saw the life we'd built together, the house, the family, the years of shared history, and I saw it crumbling beneath the weight of my betrayal. But I also saw Justin, standing there with the raw, unfiltered truth of his feelings, and I knew there was no going back. David, I said, my voice trembling. I'm sorry. He staggered back as if I'd struck him, his eyes wide with disbelief. You. His voice cracked, and he looked at Justin with a fury that made me step between them. David, please, I said, tears streaming down my face. But he shook his head, backing toward the door. I trusted you, he spat. Both of you. And then he was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Justin reached for me, but I pulled away, the weight of everything we'd done suffocating me. This is a disaster, I whispered, my voice shaking. It doesn't have to be, Justin said, his tone desperate. We can figure this out together. I looked at him, my heart breaking under the weight of the impossible choice before me. You don't understand, I said. You've destroyed my life. We've destroyed it. He stared at me, his expression crumbling. So that's it? You regret it? All of it? I hesitated, my chest tightening. I regret what it's done to him. To us. To everything I thought I was. Justin stepped back, his face a mix of hurt and resignation. I thought you felt the same way, he said softly. I did, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. But some things aren't meant to be. Without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving me alone in the wreckage of what we'd created. That night, I sat in the empty living room, staring at the blank television screen as the enormity of what I'd done settled over me. My marriage was in ruins. My sense of self was shattered. And the one person who had made me feel alive had also left me feeling more lost than ever. I had thought giving in to temptation would set me free. But all it had done was trap me in a prison of my own making. And now I had no idea how to escape.